Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar, Improve Project Closure by Beginning Your Projects with the End in Mind. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. You will have noticed that all participants have been placed on mute. This is in order to hear the main presenter's content. If you do have any questions or comments or technical challenges, I do encourage you to make use of the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen. We will be trying to answer as many questions as we can throughout today's session. However, if we don't get to your question, we will be sending out an FAQ list after the webinar, along with a recording of today's presentation. We have three main objectives for today's webinar. The first is to discuss the common reasons that projects fail to close. The second is to understand the keystone role that project closure plays in business value. And third, we want to implement tactics within your project management process that encourage successful closure. A few words about InfoTech before we get started. InfoTech is a research and advisory firm that leverages industry best practices to develop better research than anyone. Our objective is to help you drive measurable results for your IT department. Before we move forward, I'd like to do a few quick introductions. My name is Theodora Simon. I'm a senior research analyst here at InfoTech, and I work in the project portfolio management practice. I'll be acting as the moderator for today's webinar. We also have Harmandeep Chadha joining us today from our IT department. He's going to assist us with any technical challenges and ensure that we keep the webinar running smoothly. I also have my two colleagues joining us today, Matt Burton and Travis Duncan. Matt has been with InfoTech for 8 years and has 5 years with the PPM research team. He's been working in the IT industry for more than 15 years, with more than 10 years in project and product management roles. He has a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Lethbridge and an MBA and MSIM from Arizona State University. Travis has worked with the PPM practice since joining InfoTech in 2014. Prior to joining InfoTech, Travis was involved in project management in the oil and gas sector. He has also held teaching and research positions at McMaster University, as well as service delivery and program planning positions for the London Public Library. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to our main presenter, Matt Burton.
All right, thank you so much, Theodora. So first I wanted to start by giving a little bit of the landscape of project closure. And the fact is that most organizations are really good at starting projects, pretty bad at completing projects, and even worse at having those projects be adopted. And most IT departments, do struggle with project closure. And the statistics show, as you can see on your screen, that only 2.5% of companies successfully complete 100% of their projects. And this is often due to a pressure in many of our cultures to move on. So you are often forced to ignore completion criteria at the end of your project and turn your attention to the next big thing that you're supposed to be working on. And this is partly human nature. We get bored of doing the same thing over and over again, but also there's some pressure from corporations to start a new project rather than finishing the one you were previously working on. So what I want to do now is introduce a little bit of a framework and a metaphor. So you see on your screen is a thought model for project closure. And the metaphor we're using in this thought model is an arch. So if you think of an arch, let's say made out of stone or brick or something like that, arches will usually have what's called a keystone at the top that has a certain shape that allows the two sides of the arch to not fall over and collapse on themselves. And so what we're saying with this metaphor is rather than thinking about project closure as the final activity in your project or the capstone of a project, we want you to think of project closure as the keystone activity. And in fact, it's the beginning of when anyone else starts to care about your project, because it paves the way to have your project adopted by the organization and eventually achieve the business benefits. So what we're saying here is closure is the bridge that allows you to cross over from ideas to dollars. So how do we do this effectively? How do we make project closure the keystone activity in our project? Well, it starts with initiation and planning and execution. Those are all the project activities that we know about, that we're aware of. Project initiation and planning must be done with the view of and a plan for how and when the goals of the project will be achieved. If no clear expectations are set up front, you're setting yourself up for failure when you attempt to move on. And that's what we see with a lot of our clients. They are not taking the time to plan up front. And when they go to move on to their next project, it becomes difficult because they haven't planned for that transition. Adoption of the product or the service that is being implemented, the degree to which the organization accepts those changes into its daily life, and the business benefits that are realized are the only reason that your project exists in the first place. So failing to plan for that adoption and failing to set that business benefits tracking process in place will prevent you from moving on to the next thing. Another key important role in making sure your project closes is to understand your definition of done as defined by your sponsor. Most project issues are a direct result of a lack of clarity and agreement on what done looks like at the beginning. So defining done is about understanding the benefits that your sponsor needs before you get into the solution that your sponsor wants. Now, those of you that are familiar with project management will be familiar with the triangle we see on the right of your screen, what's often called the iron triangle or the triple constraints of project management. And that is finishing your project on time, on budget, and in scope. So we often tend to think about this as those things need to be in perfect balance. And we need to hit all of them perfectly. We need to get it on time, on budget, and in scope. The fact is, there's probably one of these that can act as a release valve according to the needs of your sponsor. So in other words, if it comes down to it and something needs to give, what's the least important factor to your sponsor? Is it meeting the schedule? Is it staying within budget? Or is it staying within scope? So you can think of this as taking your car to a mechanic, and your mechanic says, do you want it done good? Do you want it cheap? Or do you want it quick? Pick two. Often we can't have all three. So let's go through a few scenarios of what this might look like. A sponsor might be willing to sacrifice the time or the schedule if they are tied to a hard budget and the scope is mandated by regulation. So an example of this might be if the project is to a municipal government per se is building a park in a new neighborhood that has a fixed budget. Okay, so the park has a fixed budget and it probably has some regulation requirements. You know, maybe it has some sloping requirements for drainage, open water requirements, safety requirements for any of the equipment there. The release valve on a project like that will likely be the calendar. You may be willing to go over your target timeline in order to stay within the constraints of the other two. Let's look at another example. A sponsor might be willing to sacrifice cost if there's a mandated or hard deadline and the scope is not negotiable. So this is common in regulated industries. It's also common in some private industries. So the example I'm going to give here is the video game industry. So you think of a video game that is maybe a flagship game to a certain company. Let's say Nintendo is releasing a new Zelda or a new Super Mario game. Well, they're going to want to make sure, especially if they've announced a release date, they're going to want to make sure they hit that release date with high quality. And so they may be willing to throw extra money at that project because if the game is released with poor quality, that could harm their brand. So a third example, a sponsor may be willing to sacrifice scope and maybe even budget if the delivery of the product or service is time sensitive and will become less relevant if missed. So another example in the video game industry would be, let's say, your sports games, your seasonal sports games, an NBA video game or an NHL video game. If you don't align the release of that game with the season, you are going to miss sales and you're going to miss relevancy. So you might choose to maybe throw extra money at that, or sacrifice some quality and fix that up later with some patches to make sure you get that game out the door, coinciding with the system. All right, so back to our thought model. So what we're recommending in this project closure blueprint is that you take a 3-phased approach to the way you look at project closure. So phase 1 would be to plan and execute projects that have the possibility of closing by injecting the right closure criteria into your plan. To do this, you need to set clear expectations around closure and execution that is documented and agreed upon in the project charter. Phase 2 would be to create realistic project closure and transition processes at the project and the portfolio level that gain sign-off from the sponsor. This transfers accountability to operations, releases project resources, and avoids disrupting other projects in the portfolio that are trying to start. And that's something that is really important, that's often overlooked. If a project fails to close, it continues to consume those project resources, the project manager, also the project team members that are a part of that project team. And that's going to have a ripple effect across the rest of the organization. Phase 3 would be to plant the seeds of adoption through good organizational change management and to track the plans that tie back to the expected benefits of the project charter that were agreed upon. So you may be tempted to think the adoption of the product or service or the benefits realization are past when maybe you as a project manager or a project team are responsible for managing that project. And that would be true. But again, this is about planning for those activities and acknowledging that they need to be done in order for the business to realize that value. So while you may not be actively involved in those activities, a plan needs to be laid for those activities to happen. All right, so how are we going to do this? What are some ways that we can tactically improve our project management process in order to make project closure more successful? As a part of this blueprint, we have created a tool called the Keystone Project Management Workbook. And what we're intending for this tool to help you to do is to, 1, create a project charter that automatically starts to populate an adoption plan, as well as a benefits tracking plan. 2, perform effective requirements gathering that ties back to the project deliverables, the business benefits, and the high-level goals. 3, create a Gantt-style project schedule based on tasks that are tied to the requirements. 4, feed the project portfolio with consistent status updates. And then 5, manage scope changes by ensuring every change request impacts the benefit. I do want to emphasize the fact that this spreadsheet-based tool is just a way of highlighting a concept. These things could be done in almost any project management tool that you have out there or that you may be using now. But it is a matter of making sure these concepts are consistently applied. So let's take a look at what that looks like in the tool as part of this blueprint. So in the tool, we have a tab for the project charter. And what that charter does is it allows you to automatically start populating an adoption plan as well as a benefits tracking plan. So on the left of the screen, you see a screenshot of the project charter with your high-level goals, your business benefits, and your project deliverables. And what happens is as you document those business benefits, they automatically get ported over to the benefits tracking tab. And as you populate the deliverables in the project charter, those automatically get moved over in a drop-down for your adoption plan for training. So as you begin your project charter, you're already creating your benefits tracking plan and your adoption plan, which is really important to be thinking about that right up front. It's also really important to make sure that by the time you get to implementing that benefits tracking plan and that adoption plan, that you're referencing what the original intent of the project was in the charter. So that's why we created a relationship between those two things. All right. So the next thing that we want to do is perform effective requirements gathering that ties back to project deliverables, business benefits, and high-level goals. So within the Charter tab, we just saw a screenshot of it on the previous slide. We have another one here, and this highlights something a little bit different. In the Charter tab, we want to help you ensure that each requirement is tied to a deliverable, that each deliverable is tied to a benefit, and that each benefit is tied to a goal. So if you are filling out the charter in this tool, what you would be doing is starting by documenting your goals. But then when you get to your benefits, what the tool is asking you to do is document which goal your benefit contributes to. And that assures that those things are in sync. Once we get down to the project deliverables, we're once again asking you to create a relationship between the deliverables and the business benefits. And this enables you to make sure that you're not throwing in deliverables that don't really add value to a business benefit. And what this does in the long run, in the context of project closure, is it prevents you from doing irrelevant work and adding too much scope and focusing on things that don't ultimately matter to the project. All right, another thing we want to help you do is create a Gantt chart style project schedule based on tasks that are tied to requirements. So when you go and populate your task list and do your start and end date for your tasks in Gantt chart style, what we're asking you to do is, again, create a relationship between those tasks and a requirement. And what this helps you to do is two things. It allows you to make sure that you are covering all of the requirements in your project schedule right there in a new view. And it also allows you to make sure that all of the tasks you are assigning are actually relevant to one of the requirements in the charter. And again, this can really help you protect you, from scope creep. Another thing that we want to do is feed the portfolio with status updates. So within the tool, there's a status update tab that allows you to, in sync with your project schedule, provide consistent status updates. You can choose to do an overall status update of just simply red, yellow, green. You can get specific on scope, time, and budget, and how each of those things are, how they are tracking. And then what's not shown on this screenshot is to the right, there are more elements that allow you to do things like add comments to that status update and other bits of information. But what's key here is that you have a trailing history of all your status updates in one place in your core workbook for the project, so that you can make sure that you are providing consistent updates at regular intervals. All right, and lastly, and probably most importantly for any of you that have managed a project that has experienced scope creep, we want to manage scope changes by ensuring every change request impacts a business benefit. So on the scope change log tab, any change requests that you document, the tab is asking you to correlate that with an original business benefit from the charter. And what this does is protect the project from unnecessary change requests that might just be stakeholder wants, rather than change requests that actually impact and contribute positively to a business benefit. Ultimately, though, at the end of the day, what really matters here with project closure is the mindset. So what we want to encourage you to do is to transition from a mindset of thinking project closure as your last thing on the list to really thinking about it as that keystone activity within your project that allows you to turn the idea of the project into the dollars that the business cares about. Because ultimately, if that is not what's done, then the arch here collapses on itself and the business never sees the value of the project. All right, thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to, we're going to start the question and answer portion of the webinar.
Yeah, so I'll serve as the transitionary role here, just to say great. Thanks, Matt. That was very helpful. The first thoughts on it that I sort of like about it is we traditionally think of closure as that activity that's just kind of part of the PMLC. It's part of the project management lifecycle. It's something that a project manager has to do to complete his or her, tasks within the project plan. Within the way that you've positioned this, it very much is part of project management, but it does make the transition into other roles. I guess most significantly, organizational change management through that adoption plan, as well as even the portfolio management level through the benefits piece. And we'll come back, maybe hopefully we have time to come back to that. But I did want to start with the organizational change management piece because I'm seeing more and more that that's kind of being, it's something that project managers are being called to account to kind of think about in lieu of other resourcing to think through some of the change management or organizational change management components of a project. So when we think about that activity at closure, what do you think? What have you seen as sort of some of the biggest reasons that projects don't get adopted?
So I don't want to oversimplify that answer, but by far the biggest reason is the failure to plan for that adoption. So in the context of organizational change management, it would be not doing something like an change impact analysis during your planning and not executing on a change management plan. We got to remember that organizational change management is all about the way that a change in the workplace impacts people's lives and the way in which they do work. And if we're not accounting for that and if we're not planning for that, then the adoption of that project is not likely to succeed because, as we say in our organizational change management research, you have to plan for human nature. You can't just assume that everyone is going to act in an ideal way when it comes to the changes we impose on them.
Absolutely. Now, as something that the project manager has to take on, is the kind of approach that you've outlined there? Is it something that, because the challenge I see is that project managers are being asked to take it on, but it's again one of those things they just have to squeeze in on top of everything else. So it's a matter of kind of right sizing, I guess, the requirements within the OCM plan. So is that adoption plan that you kind of went over or spoke to, is that kind of meant to be a kind of lightweight, right sized OCM plan?
Yeah, everything in this tool is fairly lightweight. I mean, when you look at what you could do, we talk a lot about what you could do versus what you should do, and that's a great point, Travis. So when it comes to organizational change management, it really is all about like what you should do. I think though the risk of doing too little is often worse than the risk of doing too much, and you could even say, I mean, I could say anecdotally that I see too little being done way more than I see too much being done. But for someone that is time constrained and maybe doesn't see it as their role to maybe implement the change, and in many cases that may not be the case for many project managers, let's say, certainly I would say minimum viable is to just plan for it. Create some sort of adoption and transition plan within your project plan early up front. And that I would say is a minimum viable way to approach that. Any thoughts from the rest of the group here? Go ahead, Travis. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, just to kind of address some questions that are coming in, I think that segues into a question that Aiden is asking. I hope I'm getting everyone's names right. I apologize in advance if and when I don't. But Aiden's just asking about who's sort of responsible for the phases after closure. So, my question posed some ambiguity around, project managers' accountability. And when it comes to that, who's typically accountable for those things that come after closure?
Well, let's start with the last piece, business benefits. Business benefits, the big A for accountability, the sponsor. The sponsor is ultimately accountable for achieving business benefits. So they promised that this project was going to solve world hunger. A year later, are we making any inroads on solving world hunger? So that's definitely on the sponsor. When it comes to the adoption, Well, the project manager will play a role there because they had created a plan to have this thing adopted. And part of that would be to transition that plan to the people that are going to operationalize it and do the training or any other activities that may be involved in that adoption. So the accountability there often lies with the portfolio manager because they have to oversee the transition of that project if the project manager is officially kind of unassigned or off of that project. But this can vary, and I think within our modern work environments, roles are often fluid, but I think it is a good question to ask. It may vary from organization to organization, and it would probably be really valuable to seek clarity on that specifically for your organization. But the one that I would say is solidly consistent is the accountability with the sponsor on business benefits. That is 100% should be the case all the time.
Right. Yeah, I heartily agree with that. With the PMO playing that supportive role, how long should we measure benefits realization? JG, I always hate this answer, but I think it's one of those it depends answers, and we should maybe do a whole webinar on the benefits management piece. But it sort of depends on what the requirements are of the sponsor or the board that you might be reporting into, as well as how quickly a project may achieve those benefits. Once they've quote unquote been achieved, you might not want to keep on reporting of them. I worked out a workflow for my benefits management research that had you potentially, in theory, tracking benefits until you either achieve the what you had intended to, or you decommission the solution. I've never seen anyone actually do that, but in theory, you could take it that far. I did want to get to some questions that came in early, and I'm sorry, folks, I'm doing my best to keep up on the questions as they come in. Evie, I hope I'm getting that name right. She sort of posed the first question about how do we manage what done looks like. So I think referencing your slide on being clear on what done looks like during a system implementation, and the overall goal is big picture. So I think I've kind of seen this in the past around maybe if you're breaking projects into a larger program or into phases as part of a larger project, how do you kind of manage the what done looks like when maybe done hasn't been isn't maybe as concrete as you might think it is on a traditional project?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And implementing a system, I mean, there are many ways that I think that could, many different flavors of that. But I think the big risk there is sort of falling for that temptation that the technical work is done, and therefore the work is done. And so from something technical like that, I think that that's the overall sort of spirit guide that we want to be going for, is making sure that you're thinking about the non-technical work that might need to be done as well, to make sure that system is integrated, people are aware it's there if they need to be, anything along those lines. That I think is the high level theme of that definition of done. And again, that the definition of done could look so different for different types of projects. I think the process of just going through something that challenges your view on what your biases towards might be done might mean is really, really important.
Yeah, and if I could just add something in there too, I think going back to the question of its big picture, what done looks like, that also just may be an indication for you as a project manager that you do need to spend additional time with the sponsor to really iron out those details and have things that you can concretely deliver. So it is big picture. There's a lot of elements going on. So how can we drill down and really understand what it is we're driving towards? Is this going to be one project? Is this going to be multiple projects, to Travis's earlier point? Really stepping back before we jump into doing the project itself, understanding what our objective is at the end. I think that's key.
And I think, does that segue into some questions here that we've had around how this approach to closure applies to environments that rely on agile approaches to project delivery, DevOps, continuous improvement, those types of things. Like, does what you just said there about a kind of larger systems implementation, does that tie in, or is there anything from the agile world specifically that we need to factor in?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And because often there's this perception that Agile almost by default is product based and you are just continuously doing sprints based on the customer's needs and delivering what's most valuable at the time. And that can be true, but that's more of an operational nature of an operational implementation of Agile for things that may be operational products that are already living. An agile project might be a project to create a product. And in that case, it definitely will have a start and end date to when that product is launched. And really what changes in the agile approach is you still want to understand the entire scope. In an agile world, this might look like planning your epics out and getting agreement on what the goal of each epic is with your sponsor, with your customers, your product owner, whatever that looks like. And then in the more agile way, plan the details of those sprints as they become closer and as scope becomes more clear. So again, in an agile world, you may have a mix of operational product work and new project work. You may be more on one side than the other, but definitely I am a big advocate for agile projects still having complete scope planned to some degree at the beginning and also having a clear definition of done for that project.
Okay, so a similar approach that this scales to. A few questions here just around, I mean, because you've covered so much just around, this focuses on closure, but you've talked to it as a mindset that covers the project management lifecycle and beyond, which I like. I think that's a really good approach. I think that is one of the pain points that we see. But when it comes to closure activities, there's a few questions that have come in. I'm sorry, I'm not going to pinpoint the names right now, but there's a few questions that have come in, when it comes to closure activities, transitioning to support RACI documents, support model documents, those types of things. Are there any sort of particular activities or documents specific to the project closure phase that you kind of highlight or that you think are exceptionally important?
Yeah, so good question. And I didn't get to cover everything in the blueprint, so I'd encourage you to go and look at that blueprint, download it, look at the tool. There is a project closure checklist tab that I didn't really highlight, and that does give you a list and an example of things that you may want to tackle during closure. And again, in the sort of relationship nature of the tool, it does tie back to some things in the charter to make sure you are closing off things that were agreed upon in the charter. So I would say definitely minimum viable approach to project closure would be to have a checklist and to make sure you have sign off on the deliverables that were in the charter. The next most common thing is some sort of lessons learned, either document or meeting. And I think that those can be really valuable. I think, and you guys can chime in on this as well, but definitely what I'm seeing is the biggest barrier to those lessons learned meetings, documents being valuable is the fact that they often don't get used. And people struggle with an intuitive way to make sure that those lessons get injected into the next project somehow.
Absolutely. I think if I can just speak to that too, sorry, I'm not on mute. If I can speak to that too, that's kind of long been a bit of a pet peeve of mine. We do these lessons learned. I've seen lots of organizations go through the rigor, the burden, whatever you want to say, of lessons learned, and it's just more of a kind of hurdle or step that you go through administratively than something that you can actually use. So we've tried to stand up solutions like reporting solutions that make those lessons learned outputs more findable, more reportable, and more usable when it comes to informing future project planning. So I think that's an important thing to do, is make those lessons learned more actionable. The other thing I'll say on this, it doesn't quite tie into the question per se, although I will say that the RACI and that handover to operations is absolutely important. And we do have, like, on our site, lots of sort of handover to operation documents that will help there. But back to organizational change management, because again, it's so hard to talk about project closure without dipping your toes into that world. I mean, I think sort of activities around even like simple things, not simple, but in theory, like sending out surveys, post training sessions around, was this session effective? Are you ready to, absorb or adopt this product or service based upon this training, or whatever the case might be, I think can be important activities too. So what I'm trying to say is don't just stay focused on the kind of project management artifacts. I think we need to tie in some of those end user facing kind of OCM activities as well.
Yeah, surveys obviously can be controversial as far as, a lot of people are experiencing survey fatigue out there. There's a survey for this, there's a survey for that. Now I'm going to have a survey for the project I was just a stakeholder on or a customer of. And I think we can minimize a lot of that fatigue by making these surveys like really, really simple. So this struck me over the past couple of years as I've noticed as I've been out in the public, up until maybe the past year or so, but as I've been out in the public, there's been these sort of machines, like when you're leaving a building, like the gym or something, it'll be like, how was your experience today? Smiley face, happy face, or, happy face, frowny face. Just hit one of the buttons on your way out.
That's the Pearson Airport. That's the Pearson Airport bathroom experience. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And multiple airports have that as well. That's why I said I haven't really seen those much in the past year or so, because you wouldn't necessarily be touching them. Though that's a really good approach, potentially taking that same concept and bringing that to people that you're looking to get feedback from as part of your closure process. How happy are you? 1 to 10, smiley face, frowny face, anything like that can be a really good way to actually get some meaningful feedback. It doesn't always have to be incredibly detailed.
Sorry, I'm just dropping a link to the tool. There's a high demand for the tool that you've gone over. So I just dropped a link to that for the bunch of you who are asking for it into the chat. And we will make it available in our follow-up Q&A, like a link to it as well. Another question that's come up, I've sort of met this out there before working with my clients, is that I mean, within how you cover it in the research, Matt, closure is something that you think about throughout a project, and then, you tactically do at the end of it. But I also, something I find is like closure isn't something that just happens at the end of a project. And like within how you structured it, is closure something like that you need to think about in the context of those projects that are deemed non-viable and get canceled? Like, what's the type of discipline that happens around those?
Yeah, so really good question. And the closure for like early terminated projects that are low value or something along those lines might look a little different. There may still be a need for lessons learned. You could still get some valuable feedback from maybe stakeholders that were involved if you wanted to just get some experience-based feedback. A lot of the things wouldn't be as relevant. So things like your adoption plan. Unless there's partial adoption, which there may be, you may have decided to cut a project early, but you still have come up with a deliverable piece that you want to be adopted. In that case, an adoption plan potentially could be relevant. But in early termination of projects, generally that might not be important or needed. Same with benefits tracking, right? So planning for those things, would not be as relevant in projects that are terminated early, although many others may be.
Yeah, I think changing the mindset around closure to something that's not just necessarily, like, the documentation doesn't just cover the end of a project, i.e. a successfully completed one, but also something that's been terminated early. Interesting question, just while we're on this thing of benefits, and you did talk about scope changes and change requests. How do you manage a change request that introduces a new benefit not identified in the early phase? I think that was from John, I think. Can you speak to that, Matt?
Yeah, so that would be good, right? And if there's a benefit, a new benefit that hadn't been identified earlier, and you want to introduce that into the project, then that could definitely be a beneficial thing, right? And to increase benefits. Now, what you may end up doing is, if there is some pressure to maintain, let's say, a schedule or a budget, and that extra benefit is going to cost additional budget, then you may have to prioritize some of those intended benefits. And if the new benefit is deemed to be higher priority, higher value than an old benefit that was originally in the charter, then great. Let's prioritize the new one over the old one. I think though, and I was going to mention this earlier too, I keep referencing the project charter because all of these things, including the benefits management plan, the adoption plan, the schedule even, they're in the tool, they're all referencing the charter. And so it's an opportunity here to talk about that in most cases, the charter should be living. And in this tool, we encourage that idea of a living charter and to have all the requirements and the benefits be as up to date as possible. So that way, if you do get a new benefit identified by a change request, then yeah, maybe we accept that change request, but let's also update the charter to make sure it is in our current agreement.
I would say too, though, that I would be hesitant of people requesting something that's going to have an additional business benefit. I just find from my exposure that I've had with a lot of our clients that their benefits realization process is something that they are really trying to mature, but there's very few organizations that I can point to that have mastered that. And so if you're never closing the loop on the ability to actually having realized that benefit, I can see that really derailing the project. If, we're injecting new benefits, we're never tracking whether or not we fully realize them, but all of a sudden, our budget is overrun or our schedule is overrun. So I think there is a little bit of a judgment call there too with what is our maturity level when it comes to benefits realization? How confident are we that we could actually achieve this from, our past experiences?
Yeah, that's a really good point. We often talk about I spoke earlier about the accountability for benefits being on the sponsor. If there is no way to hold the sponsor accountable and have them commit to benefits, then receiving additional benefits into the scope of the project could just be as slippery of a slope as just accepting change requests. I think the important thing here, though, is to make sure you are at least vetting those change requests by looking at the potential value they could add to the project. Because I think the larger problem out there is people abusing that scope change request process by keeping a dedicated lane of resources opening to them at their disposal. I'm talking about the sponsor here abusing this. So adding just an extra little layer of protection won't necessarily cure the illness here, but it could add a layer of protection to increase the thought and the discipline around those scope change requests.
That makes sense. I do want to come back to, I hope the time's still right for this, but I missed a couple from Raj that are good here around the concept of MVP, and he has some good commentary here. He said he's seen his PMs push MVP, which you were speaking to earlier, Matt, which he calls maximum viable pain. I haven't heard that one before, as some of the PMs focus on just the time. So MVP is sort of a much maligned word in his organization, as PMs feel it's their kind of get out of jail card free lever that they pull. Can you sort of speak to that if we go back to that idea of kind of defining closure and thinking what MVP looks like? Like, is there any tactics that you've seen, whether it's from a governance level or from a kind of a project management tactic to help alleviate this problem?
So I'm not sure I understand the question. Sorry. So the maximum viable pain as opposed to minimum viable product, or
yeah.
Like I can't see the question. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. And I'll just speak to it first. So MVP being that card that PMs play as their get out of jail free card. I don't think I've seen it as much. I guess the first question would be like, I necessarily haven't seen it, but Raj has identified it as a pain point for his people. Like the first thing that came to mind for me would just be really good discipline during the charter phase around what those closure items would be, and maybe not allowing the PMs to deviate from that, maybe making MVP a little bit more of a I guess less of a sort of like if you're more of a kind of agile environment and MVP is the norm, maybe crisping up on some of the some of the discipline around that. That's the only thing I could think of,
Okay.
Raj, on that piece.
Well, I think to your point there too, that word viable is important. If you're minimizing things to the point where they no longer become viable and it's being used as a get out of jail free card or a way to escape all discipline, then that would not be viable. So yeah, that does sound like a bit of an abuse of the term or of the word. So I would yeah, I would answer that by, hey, let's make sure viable is not forgotten about, and we're not just focusing on minimum.
Yeah, and I think part of this is who they're getting the pressure from, Raj. I just saw your other question jump in there. I think it'd be who the pressure is coming from as well. The pressure to deliver MVP. So if it's coming from the sponsor, it gets a little bit more thorny and political. So it's maybe something that's not easy to answer because every situation might be unique. But yeah, I think that's again back to kind of what Matt said when I'm emphasizing around discipline around that charter phase. Another piece too was the concept of a pre-mortem, so a kind of closure activity happening at the start of a project. My thoughts on that are that that's really sort of a risk analysis, like it's a type of a risk activity that you can do during project planning. I think it's I think it's a valid one as long as you double back to it at the end to kind of do that post-mortem as well, like to have that line that connects the two. We have some examples on our website of what a pre-mortem can look like, as well as other just more traditional risk sort of assessments up front.
Can I also just jump in and give my 2 cents on the minimum viable pain question there? I think there's an element here of what's within the control of the project manager and what is governed at the portfolio level. So if you're getting that pressure from the sponsor to deliver the project, ultimately they're the ones holding their hand up saying, this is my project, this is what I want. You're pushing that out, that has to be reported somewhere else at the portfolio level. And it has to be recognized by the organization that that's a shift that they don't want to accept. They don't want to accept the projects that aren't delivering any value. And so I do think there is that additional level of governance that needs to be considered. You control what you can as a project manager, but there is also that role of the portfolio that really is meant to set projects up for success. And that is something we talk about a lot in our practice, obviously being the project portfolio management practice. So that's where you're going to see a lot of the success coming from, is making sure those processes are also put in place.
I think it's maybe a good segue to a question that came in from Edward. I think the question is benefits realization. Is it something that project managers do, or is it something that portfolio managers do? My early read on that and how we covered in our benefits research is there's really a fellowship of the benefits. I mean, the accountability sits with the sponsors who upfront are supposed to be the ones defining those, forecasting what those will be ideally, and committing to achieving those forecasts. That's done better in some organizations than others when it comes to those commitments up front and those forecasts. I think at that point, once the business case is approved, once the benefits are approved, it really segues to the to the PMs to be the stewards of the benefits during project execution. As we were saying, earlier, to I think it was John's question, as scope changes, you need to assess how that impacts the benefits. Once the project closes, I think traditionally it's back to the sponsor and his or her delegates to kind of follow through on the tracking and reporting piece with, I'll say, the PMO or the portfolio manager playing a very strong supportive role in facilitating the collection of the data, the reporting of the data, all that kind of stuff. So it really does take a fellowship on the benefits realization side.
And third parties are often involved. So like the finance department is often needed in collaboration to produce those reports. So that's a common one. And I would say that from, our interest as, PMOs, portfolio managers, project managers, a portfolio manager, the best thing they can do for benefits is get us, as Travis just said, get a commitment from the sponsor up front during the intake process to a forecast. That really sets the portfolio manager up to add value. And then a project manager, the best thing they can do is get a little bit more specific on specific benefits and create a plan to track those with the sponsor in collaboration with the sponsor during the planning process. And then after the project, it definitely becomes less about the project manager because they should be gone. And then as Travis said, everything that he just said kicks in there. It becomes a fellowship, a collaboration with those other parties. But the project manager, I would say, their main role is to make that a part of their plan.
Just a quick thought here. Can we talk about the things that are outside of the project manager's purview when it comes to closure, outside of the sponsors even? Because so much of this is about good planning at the project specific level. But like we've been mentioning portfolio management quite a bit here in the last little bit. Um, Apart from what we've just said about its role in benefits management, like what role does a portfolio manager have to play in project closure and making sure that projects get closed successfully and adopted? What do the portfolio activities look like?
Yeah, so the main role is to make sure the right projects get approved and that there is value committed to and promised during an intake process. Make sure that the portfolio manager also should be making sure that resources are allocated appropriately to projects. There was a stat up there in one of the slides that said most organizations are overwhelmed with too many projects going on at once and that growing backlog. A portfolio manager can set a project manager up for successful closure by making sure that the project manager and those resources on the project team are not allocated to too many projects at once. And that's the main thing. That's the biggest thing that they can do. There are others too, like during execution. I showed the status update tab. A portfolio manager has to make status updates visible to whoever is steering the portfolio, whether it be a steering committee, executive layer, so that they can make appropriate decisions on that project, be it resourcing, be it prioritization, additional time to complete it. Again, those decisions can really make or break whether closure or the project in general succeeds or not.
Yeah, so again, I think even not just even beyond benefits, I think that closure thing, yeah, is really connects the sort of triangle of PM, sponsor, and portfolio manager.
There is a really good question in the Q&A right now about how do I as a PM hold a VP or director accountable for benefits realization? And I think this is really important where we distinguish project management from portfolio management, right? So the different levels of governance that you have. It's going to be very difficult for you as a project manager to hold those people to account. But at that portfolio level, it's assumed that the portfolio has the authority to say, you know, we're tracking this, we're able to see you either have or have not been able to realize those benefits. So that really, again, is escalating up to the portfolio level. I think that's one aspect of it. I think the second aspect, which Matt touched on earlier too, is you want to start from the beginning by getting that sponsorship commitment to those business benefits and also really laying out the role of the sponsor. I think a lot of people think about the sponsorship role as really being the signature on the line, but it is so much more than that. And without a clear roadmap for what activities a sponsor should be involved with throughout the course of the project and post-project, you really are setting yourself up for failure. There's a misalignment of expectations there on what that role entails. Curious, Travis, if you have any other thoughts on that.
I was going to pivot to Aiden's question there too. My first response was going to be that they don't. You know, how does a PM hold a VP accountable for benefits realization? They don't. They can't. It sort of gets into organizational politics, hierarchies in a lot of way. I think having that PMO infrastructure in place helps a bit because typically a PMO manager, director, portfolio manager, director sits a little bit closer in the org chart to kind of having those types of relationships. I think just starting with a process, so at least having a process in place where you can at least begin to hold them to account. As well as the reporting. So I'm a big fan of benefits, like reporting on benefits through dashboards. And there's, you know, if you build it, they might come, and through that type of reporting, you can maybe get some interest on, how different business units, different sponsors are sort of performing when it comes to actual benefits realization and reporting. So making it visible, making it public, it's just one of the levers that you can pull at the level of a kind of portfolio manager level. But there's no easy way, and I think it requires, again, back to this topic of OCM, requires some OCM just to begin with, just to even get those types of people involved in a benefits management process. So it's not easy, and I would certainly, just to iterate one thing, I would take it off the PM shoulders as much as possible. It shouldn't be their issue. That's where you want to lean on, as Tio was saying, that kind of PMO level. Matt, sorry.
Yeah, no, good. No, and I'll just add to that. Like, I agree with all of that. The PM can't hold the sponsor accountable, but what they can do is throw the documented benefits in their face a lot. And that's really what we've intended to do with this tool, is just constant reminder. Okay, yeah, you want a scope of change request? Which one of these benefits is that we committed to is going to impact? So that's tactically. Ultimately, the sponsor overrides the PM, right? The PM doesn't really have authority there. But what they can do, to Travis's point about visibility and reporting, they can bring that information in front of their eyes more often as a bit of a lever or a tool.
Absolutely. So there's a bunch of questions here still in the chat that I'm kind of combing through. I think we can get about one more in with the time that we have here. So I'm going to try and make it a good one. And I will just say that we will be sending out, for any questions that we didn't get to in the Q&A, we will be sending out, as part of the kind of webinar follow-up, a fact sheet that sort of runs through. We'll spend some time post-webinar going through some questions. So I think, in terms of a last question, this is tough. Teal, if anything's popping out to you, I'm just trying to find the last question here, and there's a few that are jumping to mind, and I'm trying to pick the right one here. There was one at the bottom of my mouse is freezing up here at the end here. It was about it was a really good question about the role of, there it is, a systems engineer. So where does systems engineering touch points? How do they figure into this closure model, or do they? If we think about more of the technical side, is that covered in the handover to operations documentation, Matt, typically?
It probably would be. I think there's a lot of maybe context there, and I'm not a systems engineer, so I wouldn't necessarily have the greatest insight on this. But it would depend a lot on the context and I would say the role of the system within that project. Often there may be a system engineer that was part of the planning, a part of the execution of the project, but may not be part of maintaining it. So in that case, there may be multiple system engineers that need to communicate through that closure process. If it's a smaller group and it's the same system engineer that was part of planning and execution that will also be maintaining it, that becomes a little less of an issue with this project closure topic, but still could become one because there often is that temptation to keep that lane of capacity open to that system engineer as during their project time, as opposed to maybe tickets that come in for them to work on, or any operational needs that may come up.
Gotcha. Okay. It's an interesting question, interesting topic. Tio, how are we doing for time? Do we have time for one more? On my clock, which is, we covered a little bit fast. I have 2 o'clock, so.
We're at 1:59 right now.
Harm, do we have time for one more, or should we cut ourselves off here?
I think that's enough time we have in this session.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm sorry, everyone who I didn't get to. I apologize. They were just coming fast and furious. So as I said, we will address those post-webinar.
Big thank you to Matt, Travis, Harmandeep, and to all the participants for joining us today. We thank you for your time, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.